Well, today we're going to conclude this series we've been doing about the stories from the book of Daniel. You remember we started with the first story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And if you remember, the real high point of that story is not at the end when they walk out of the furnace unscathed, but the high point of that story is when they look a tyrant in the eye and say, our God is able to deliver us. But even if God does not deliver us, we will not bow down to you and we will not serve you. Now that's faith. And then last week we looked at the story about the handwriting on the wall. It seems that, in the Bible all the time, that all these tyrants, eventually they press God's patience a little too far. And so the handwriting on the wall was to tell Belshazzar that not only was his rule over, but so was the entire Assyrian nation. They were done. And now the Medes and the Persians were going to come in. They were going to take over. And as you recall, these stories are really important to the first readers of the book of Daniel because they were living under a tyrant in their own time, a man named Antiochus Epiphanes, who was making life miserable for them. So last week's story especially is about hope. To never give up hope because God will have the last word. And then last week also reminded us of the importance of humor because it's hard to be afraid of something that you can laugh at. And now today, we come to the end of the narrative section of the book of Daniel. We're going to look at the last story and the most well-known story of the book of Daniel, and that's the story of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. So this morning, instead of looking at it as a children's story, let's hear what it has to say to adults. So Daniel, by God's grace, has survived two Babylonian tyrants, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. But now there's a new king, and his name is Darius. And Daniel had worked in the administrations of those two previous kings and had kind of worked his way up. And then Darius came in, saw that Daniel was very good at what he did. He was impressed with Daniel. He actually promoted Daniel a little more in his own government. So Daniel had this sort of important role. It kind of reminds us of the story of Joseph. If you remember when he got to Egypt and he ended up being promoted to the second in command of all of Egypt, just behind Pharaoh himself. Well, Daniel's kind of making his way up the ladder. And the problem in the story today arose when some of the other government officials were jealous of Daniel. They were jealous because he was getting promotions and they weren't. He was moving up the ladder and they weren't. And after all, he wasn't even from there. Good Persian jobs are for Persians. And here's these Jews coming in here and taking over and controlling everything and in charge of everything. And they want to get rid of him. So Daniel did his job so well that they couldn't find any way to get him into trouble based on his job. But Daniel was a deeply devout man. And if they couldn't get him in trouble over his work, maybe they could get him in trouble over his religion. Maybe they could get him in trouble over his faith. And so they kept an eye on Daniel. And after a while, they noticed that when he went home, that he would kneel down by a window in his house 3 times a day, and he would pray to the God of Israel. Daniel didn't go around bragging about his faith. He didn't go around making a big deal out of it. He just lived out who he was. He didn't expect any of them to believe what he believed. He didn't force it on anybody. He just lived out his faith and his belief in the God of Israel. Now, on the other hand, if Daniel's faith had made no impact on his life, then they wouldn't have even noticed it. If Daniel's faith had just been convenient, he would have never gotten in trouble for it. I remember years ago, I heard a story about this old farmer that someone asked him, "Are you a Christian?" And he took a piece of paper and he wrote down about 4 names on it, and he gave it to the guy, and he said, These are my neighbors. Ask them. If I'm a Christian, they should know. I remember hearing a sermon years ago that the gist of it was, if it were against the law to be a Christian, is there enough evidence in your daily life for you to be convicted? There was in Daniel's. Like I said, he wasn't pushy, but he was who he was, and who he was a follower of God, and it just showed in his life. So they devised this plan, and they went to King Darius. In the Middle Eastern culture of that day, kings believed they were divine. That if you were a king, you became divine. Some leaders still think that today, so some things haven't changed. But they went to him, and they decided to play to his ego. They encouraged him to pass this law that no one could worship any other god for an entire month except him, and that everybody would be forced to pray to him and to no other gods. And to sweeten the pot a little, if they didn't, they would be thrown to the lions. And so they even told him that, they discussed this with all the other, leaders, and everybody agreed, thought it was a great idea. Well, they lied. They didn't discuss it with anybody else. They certainly didn't discuss it with Daniel. They did all this kind of behind his back. So Darius, he liked the idea of being God of the month, and so he passed the law. So let me read to you. This is from Daniel chapter 6, beginning in verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where his windows opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So Daniel's faith wasn't regulated by government rules and whims. Daniel did what he always did. He went home, he got down on his knees, and he prayed. And I think it's interesting, especially this Sunday before Thanksgiving, it says that Daniel prayed a prayer of thanks. He got on his knees and he thanked God for all the good things going on in his life. And then meanwhile, the men who were out to get him, they were spying on him and collecting evidence to bring before the king. And notice their approach to the king. They sort of buttered him up and went to him and said, you made this rule that for a month, everybody had to pray to you and they weren't allowed to pray to any other gods. I mean, kind of hypothetically, what would you do if someone didn't do that? Would you really throw them to the lions? Just to get Darius to say, if someone doesn't follow the rule, we're going to throw them to the lions. And then they said, well, Darius, guess who isn't doing what you said? It's Daniel. And they knew that Darius liked Daniel. And so they took this kind of roundabout way to kind of back him into the corner. So let me read in verse 13. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree which you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. And when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and make every effort until the sundown to save him. Now this is the part of the story that both fascinates and confounds me. Because he didn't want to go through with this. And I understand that in that culture, once the king made a law, the law couldn't be reversed, not even by the king. But he didn't want anything to happen to Daniel. He understood that he'd been duped, that this whole God of the month thing was just a ruse in order to get rid of Daniel. And I understand he couldn't revoke the order that he gave, but it looks like he could have done something. I mean, the same sort of thing happens in the book of Esther. There's a guy named Haman who goes to King Xerxes and convinces him that they need to have a day to go out and massacre all the Jews. And Xerxes didn't care, so he signed it into law. And then his new wife came up to him and reminded him that she was Jewish. And so he knew he was in trouble. He couldn't revoke the law. So what he did was he sent warning to all the Jewish people in all the towns, and he also armed them. That kind of took care of the massacre. They weren't able to do it then. So he found a way to block, what he had said. And it's like, why can't Darius do that? I mean, the text says he made every effort to save Daniel. But I read, apparently, he couldn't come up with anything? Really? How about feed the other guys to the lions first and then put Daniel down there when they're not hungry anymore? Or how about put Daniel in with the really old lions who can't move around very much? Or maybe even put a battalion of soldiers down there with Daniel to protect him against the lions. I don't know. I thought of those in a few minutes. Surely he could come up with something. But when it comes to saving Daniel, he's got nothing. They couldn't think of anything. And the irony is that Daniel had survived two ruthless tyrants, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. When they called you in, you never knew if you were going to get promoted or beheaded. And now here's Darius. Darius is not like them. Darius is actually a nice guy. But as it turns out, he's a weak leader. And he allows these people who are supposed to be working for him to end up making the rules and doing what they want to do instead of what he wants done, even to the point of killing someone that the king liked. And as I read that, it really reminded me of an important truth, is that this is the kind of thing that happens when leaders fail to lead. When a leader doesn't lead, someone else always steps up to fill the void. And the person that steps up to fill the void often is not the right person. They're often doing it because they just want the power or a selfish agenda for some reason. But when leaders fail to lead, this is what happens. It happens in government, it happens in businesses, it happens in churches. When leaders don't lead, bad things usually happen. So if you are in a position of leadership, at work, in an organization, a church, please lead. We need leaders to lead, because when we don't lead, bad things can happen. So they carried out the order, and they threw Daniel into the pit with lions. Let me read verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace, and he spent the night without eating, without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. So they threw Daniel in the pit of lions. They covered the mouth of the pit with a stone. And here's the irony, is Daniel doesn't seem to be worried or upset. But the king is freaking out. He's so upset he can't eat, he can't sleep, he can't watch TV. He was distraught. And as soon as the sun rose the next morning, he ran to the pit, rolled away the stone, and see what had happened. And then verse 21, Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent this angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They've not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, Your Majesty." I think it's sort of funny. He's worried whether or not Daniel's going to be alive, and the first thing Daniel says is, "Long live the king." Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there was a fourth person in the furnace with them who protected them. And then Daniel says God sent a messenger to protect him. And of course, in Christian theology, we always read back into that fourth person is Christ. In Jewish theology, that fourth person is always an angel. Either way, God saves Daniel, rescues Daniel. And then at the end, Daniel says, by the way, I didn't do anything to you to deserve this. And you can't blame him for being a little snarky at the end of this ordeal. So the story ends well for Daniel. It doesn't end very well for his conspirators because the king decided he didn't need a law to throw them in with the lions, and so he did. And no one rescued them. And so Daniel gets promoted, and Darius recognizes that the God Daniel serves is not like the gods of the Assyrians, but that he is a living God who is concerned and active in our lives. And children love these stories from the book of Daniel. They're full of adventure, they're full of miracle, but there's truth there that we adults need to hear as well. When you're faced with a difficult situation in life, no matter what it is, it's easy to lose heart, to just give up, to just lose heart. I received a text once that said, "Isn't one of the greatest temptations we have to lose heart?" Well, Daniel did not lose heart under persecution. He didn't lose heart under promotion. He didn't lose heart when he was praying at the window. He didn't lose heart when they threw him in a pit of lions. Daniel knew that he served a God who loved him. And just like his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even if God didn't deliver him, he served a God that's still worthy of worship and worthy of love and obedience. And so do we. This is the Reign of Christ Sunday, where we are reminded that Jesus is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings and the ruler over all. And that no matter what we face, the God who created everything that exists is in love with you. Head over heels in love with you. And will be with you. And will give you strength. And will help you to know God's presence. So the message of the book of Daniel is that this God we serve is worthy of our worship, is worthy of our love. Don't ever lose heart, because this God is with us. And that's the message of the book of Daniel to the first folks who read it, just like it's the message to us. God loves you. God is with you. Don't ever, no matter what you face, don't ever lose heart. Amen.